Rock solid.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the first video in a series where I look back at Worlds 2025 for the LPL and share my thoughts about what went wrong. Because let's be real, this World sucked for the LPL. In this first video, I'm going to give my overall thoughts on just what happened and what went wrong, and then I'm going to follow up with one video for each of the teams that went, including IG, and those videos are going to be a little bit more analytical, looking at some gameplay clips, their drafts, what champs they were prioritizing, maybe some draft blunders they made, and then what they might look to change for next year, including players as well as like overall strategic things. So diving right in, yeah, let's cut to the chase. This Worlds was just terrible for the LPL. If we look at the hard results, IG was knocked out in play-ins. I think by far the majority of people didn't have them beating T1 in that series, but the way in which it played out was just brutal because, game one, I think they pretty firmly had it in their pockets, and then they threw it with some inting. Game two, they smashed them. And then when they started to give fans hope that T1, this demon that actually won Worlds this year, could be taken out in play-ins, they snatched it away from us. I think game three, some brutal inting from the Shy again. And then in game four, I think Rookie was the main offender after playing what was a really good series. But I know the Shy tanked a lot of the flame for game four with his Varus top. I don't actually think the Varus top was that bad in that game. I think especially once he gets Zhonya's, it sort of shifts things around a little bit. But ultimately, we sort of saw once he got Nocturne ulted after he had the Zhonya's, the fight start to play out a little bit differently. But T1 was just so far ahead at that point that it doesn't really matter. And yeah, that was just a rough one. BLG, first seed of the LPL, they got Swissed, grouped, whatever the heck you want to call it. It sucked anyways. I think they were the one team that people maybe had some hope for to make a run in the tournament. They were, I think, pretty universally selected as a team to make the semifinals at the very minimum. Maybe some people had them as finalists. Some crazy BLG fans maybe had them winning the tournament, although I don't think most did. And then we only had one LPL team in semis, which was Top Esports, and they got mercilessly slaughtered by T1. Jackie Love and 369, they put up a good fight, but really the rest of the team kind of rolled over and died, and T1 just stomped them 3-0. And this has to be just the most pathetic Worlds from the LPL that we've ever seen. We've had some ridiculous incidents where teams go out in groups, but on the whole, I think things have generally never looked as bad as this since 2018 when LPL won their first Worlds. So if we look back and just do a rough comparison, in 2024, BLG made it to the finals, right? It went all 5 games. I think by and large they were the better team that series, but Faker had some incredible moments, and I think it was game 4 on the Silas that just completely swung the momentum of the series right around into the favor of T1. And without those ridiculous heroics, like I think BLG probably could have taken that series and, coulda, shoulda, woulda, but I don't think you can look back on that year and say, oh, the LPL was terrible. That same BLG were also the finalists at MSI, which T1 notably was not. So on average, they were for sure one of the top teams that year, and I don't think the region as a whole was particularly weak. 2023, 3 out of 4 semifinalists were LPL teams. Obviously, we know what happened with JDG falling apart in that semifinal series, Ruler getting caught, and also really the bot lane meta being something that T1 were uniquely positioned to take advantage of. I think that ADCs being playable for support was something that Keria could exploit in a way that no one else was going to be able to. So that was a little unfortunate. And then, of course, BLG got upset by Weibo on the other side of the semis, and so Weibo lost 3-0 to T1 in the finals, and I think it's pretty clear that they were maybe the worst team from the LPL that year that was at Worlds from a talent standpoint. BLG, I think they probably would have taken one game off of T1 in the finals, but I don't think they would have won anyways, so it doesn't really matter. 2022, I think, was actually kind of similar to this year from a Worlds perspective. Top Esports got grouped in 22, and that happened to BLG this year, and then the best team from the LPL, based on their Worlds showing at least, AL this year and EDG that year, got knocked out in quarters by the eventual Worlds winners in a banger 5-game series. And I think it sucks that AL's run got cut short in the quarterfinals by losing to the eventual winners, but it is what it is. 2021, of course, EDG, they won Worlds, and Yeah, 3 out of 4 semifinalists were LCK teams, but I do think that RNG was a very strong contender that year, probably a top 3 team at that tournament, and they played against EDG in the quarterfinals, lost in 5 games, really close series. So yeah, that's kind of unfortunate. So yeah, it's pretty clear that this year marked a very huge decline in LPL Worlds performances. I think 2022 was maybe the most similar, but outside of that, this year was brutal in that there were no finalists in any of the 3 international competitions this year that were LPL representatives, including at first stand, where there was only 1 team from each region, and still the LPL did not make the finals. So just absolutely brutal year overall. But I don't think this is going to be representative of the future. I don't think the LPL needs to just roll over and become the LCK's punching bag every year like they kind of were before 2018. I really think that there are some things that can happen that will turn things around. I mean, yes, it sucks that this failure happened while Worlds was in China. I think that does make it a little more significant that the fans are really just going to be disappointed and let down. But I don't think that the LPL is condemned to a downward spiral for the rest of its future. There were a few bright spots from this tournament. I think AL actually looked kind of good, really good. Flandre, he's a very seasoned player at this point, but he's just still playing incredibly. I think he's greatly underrated in 2024. I think he was much better than Sheer. For some reason, I don't think that take was very common, but I think he was a lot better than Sheer last year. This year, I think there were definitely points of the year where he was the best top laner in the world. I think leading up to MSI, he was probably the best, and then Keen was much better than him at MSI itself. Shanks and Kyle, 2 players that were really good at MSI and EWC, but then really dropped off for LPL Summer Split. And I think it's a big reason why people weren't too hot on the roster coming into Worlds. Kyle especially had a massive drop-off domestically for Summer, and then the 2 of them really turned it up at Worlds. I think Shanks was probably the best mid laner in the Swiss stage, and in the quarterfinals, by and large, he was definitely gapped by Faker. But other than BDD, who wasn't this series or this Worlds? And I do think that we can really look forward to AL being a stronger team in the future. I think Hope is a player that really just doesn't belong on that team. Every time I think about the AL roster, I'm sort of thinking about that meme with the 4 soldiers and the 1 clown they're hiding behind the wall together. And not to dunk on Hope too much, but he's just really not that top tier of player that you need to be winning Worlds. We've seen that before on JDG when he was the clear weak link in their series against T1, getting dunked on by Gumayushi and Keria. So it kind of leads into my next topic, which is that the LPL rosters this year were mostly pretty terribly constructed. I think maybe the AL management didn't have as much faith in their roster at the start of the year as I did, because I saw this roster and I was like, wow, Shanks, hugely underrated player, Flandre, incredible top laner, Tarzan, at his peak, best jungler in the world, and Kyle, oddly enough, I don't think Kyle got enough recognition before this year. I think when he was on Sandbox with Prince, he was the best part of that team by a pretty solid margin. And last year as well, when he was playing for AL, I do think he was really good, but they just didn't have the rest of the pieces that they needed in order to have, a fully strong roster. And I guess Hope's contract didn't expire, so they kept him into 2025, and that was a big blunder on their part. But I do think, it already sounds like because they saved so much money this year with a really cheap roster, they'll be able to run things back again, I hope. I think Shanks is already going to be re-signing with them, along with Tabe, based on what I've heard. So that's definitely something to look forward to there. I do think some of the other rosters, Top Esports, Kanavi and Hong, they've been notable international inters. So while I do think that they fit a very cohesive and strong team identity for Top Esports, where the 2 of them were driving a really strong, clean, and decisive early game, I do think that hurts a top team, because ultimately, internationally, those 2 players have really struggled to perform. I think 369, sometimes he gets ragged on for choking internationally, but If you really look at it, I don't think that's the case. I think MSI 2023, he was incredible. I think Worlds 2023, yeah, he rightfully caught some blame, but I think the meta massively shifted out of his favor, and that put him in a tough position. I think in Worlds 2022, he had an incredible series into Zeus, and then this year, once again, he was really good, but, and Jackie Love as well, I think he also sometimes gets labeled a bit as a choker, but I think he played a really, really strong Worlds this year. But ultimately, Kanavi and Hong being on that team dragged them down when it mattered against T1. And finally, BLG, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone what went wrong with that team. Yeah, Bin didn't have the best year, but everyone's looking at the jungle situation. Beishuan, much like Hope, I think there's probably 7 to 8 players in the LPL in their position that I could confidently rank as better than them. Shadow, I do think, is a pretty good player, but BDG or BLG really seemed to be interested in having this roster swap situation where they would put in one jungler, try and draft around them, and then swap out for the other jungler. And it was kind of funny because there was a bit of a jungler swap buff that was going on for a while where it seemed like if they lose with one jungler and put in the other one, immediately they'd start winning again. But I really think that was more of a fun meme than anything. I do think would have been best for that roster as soon as they signed Shadow to just stick with him for the rest of the year because he was very clearly the better player. And I guess a last little bit of silver lining from this year is that Jackie Love isn't going to be completely retiring. As I mentioned, I do think he had a pretty good Worlds against KT, which was the first series where Top Esports collapsed. I think it was pretty clear that he was one player that was not collapsing. And then once again versus T1, I thought he had a beautiful series, and the thought of that being his farewell I definitely had a tear running down my cheek after that series ended. Just I think in particular that Corki game from him very much embodied who he was as a player throughout his career. In lane, I think he was absolutely smashing the T1 bot lane. They were blowing flashes, chunking them under tower, playing super aggressively. And then in the side lane, when he swapped to top lane, he Valkyried forward to block Faker's Galio E. Who would do that other than him? They ended up getting the kill, diving him under tower, and then once again in the mid lane, they aggressively dove Gumayushi and blew him up. And I think maybe the most funny one was after T1 took the dragon, Jackie Love got a good chunk onto Keria, and then he flashed forward to finish him off, immediately getting blown up by T1, and his team ended up following up a little bit late to get a few more kills, which I think, it's really funny because I don't know if many fans are aware of this, but Jackie Love is actually a primary shot caller for Top Esports. So sometimes he rallies them forward by throwing his body into the enemy team. And I do think maybe if Kanavi wasn't auto-attacking a control ward and followed up a little quicker, it would have went even better for them. And then obviously for the rest of that game, he was just getting dove sometimes by 4 champions from 3 different angles. Very hard for him to play, but I do think it was a bittersweet, what I thought ending to his career, but I'm really happy to hear that he'll be back for some more. I do think that his popularity as a player is something that China needs as it's going through this rough transition period. So yeah, by and large, those are my thoughts on Worlds 2025 for the LPL, just at a surface level. I'm going to be following up with one of the videos for each of the teams, starting with IG. Yeah, they only played one series, but I do think there's some interesting things to talk about there from a draft perspective, from a gameplay perspective. Yeah, I hope you tune into that one, and thank you for watching this video. Take care.